Part 3, Chapter 28 of If All These Young Men by Romer Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 3, Berkshire. Chapter 28, The Enchanted Hind. Josephine stayed with Susan all the afternoon in the hot garden room. She lay awake and dreamed of hot wharves and other spots smelling of sun-warmed tar. And in all these places she saw herself accompanied by a tall, pale young man who told her that she was the most wonderful woman in the world. She held long conversations with him among crab pots and upturned boats, but in the middle of some tender speech her dream fell away, and she began the whole inconclusive scene again. 20 times her fancies ended in the same place, and 20 times she found herself stiff with fear, watching Susan's face. Once, as a young man's voice faded in Josephine's ears, Susan stopped reading and said sharply, "What are you staring at, Josephine? What is it?" "I am jealous of the book," Josephine replied. But as Susan began to read again, Josephine knew that she was really jealous of the aching in Susan's heart and the emptiness in her mind. She wished her love were able to cure Susan. She longed with pain to fill her mind with happiness. In 2 years, she said to herself, Susan will come back from the dead. Leave her alone. But like the mother of Proserpina, Josephine wished to go down into Hades and drag her back into the world. She could not be patient because she loved Susan as dearly as Proserpina loved her daughter. Only the sun and books, thought Josephine, looking at her. I am powerless. Love's a poor thing. Have I lost her? My God, I would like to shake her. I can't fight against temperament. It's like fighting time. Once more she saw in Susan the million years of her descent from Adam and Eve. Christ, she thought, and sometimes their genius will all crop out in one place, and sometimes their pessimism. After tea, Josephine went down again into the orchard. She was beginning to be excited. She did not wish to meet Sebastian first in the house in company with other people. At tea her excitement had showed itself in her face, and she had been gay and a little boisterous, and had felt that the Sharps were not so much opposed in feeling to her after all, but in reality they had not changed. Down in the orchard everything was gold and azure and verdant green. The gold sun blazed high in heaven, scarcely a third part from the zenith. In the north, slowly moving clouds reared their majestic heights, and among their efflorescent peaks, fancy wandered down soft white valleys and in and out of foamy caverns. The afternoon was full of grandeur. The leaves, flowers, and trees had lost their colors in the green and gold, and become part of the solemn beauty of the day. Only the idle call of cuckoos fell upon the air, and all other sounds that had been sharp and clear in the morning were subdued in the afternoon repose. Josephine lay down upon her rug with a book of Shakespeare's plays in her hand, but she did not read. She thought only of Sebastian, of the time of his arrival, and of what he and she would say and do to one another. Presently, in the midst of her excitement, she began to feel sad. The old notion of enchantment came over her, and of inability either to be herself or to express herself. She could not change herself from the wretched thing the world thought her. She was imprisoned in it. She was buried in a living grave. She was a fairy condemned to be a beggar. She was a goddess changed into a mean woman. She was divine Venus herself in a mask. If Sebastian only loves me, he may find out what I am, she said to herself. Perhaps he loves me a bit. Perhaps he thinks me not quite so bad as the rest do. Dear Sebastian. She thought that perhaps he found her something less repulsive than an ugly young woman, and cared for her as he might care for an animal. One day he might even say, since he had begun to care for her a little, "Will you marry me, dear hind?" as they said in the fairy books, and she thought for a minute she was an enchanted hind, and that the prince who led her about with rosetted ribbons was Sebastian. But the next moment she perceived that she was mistaken. The prince was her own prince out of dreamland. She laughed as if she were in a bower in Olympus, waiting to entertain the thoughts of an earthly creature, and became so sure that she was Venus that she began to wonder if Sebastian were worth the condescension of so godly a girl. The shadows began to lengthen in the garden. The daisies closed, and the narcissus and lilac gave out a pungent odor. When the sun was descended so low that all the trees stood gold in the sunless green garden, Josephine heard a voice up at the house cry, "Hello!" Then another voice cried, "Hello! Hello, Sebastian!" And Sebastian answered, "Hello!" When she heard Sebastian's voice, Josephine became herself again. Venus went back to heaven. Fairies, princes, and young men sprang into their appropriate places in the book of dreams. And she sat alone in the orchard, listening to the sound of voices in conversation on the terrace. There seemed to be any amount of talk, and she had half a wish to go and join in it. But presently she heard footsteps coming down the gravel path inside the yew hedges, and she knew that only one person was walking there, and that it was Sebastian. In a few moments she looked up, and there stood Sebastian outside the hedge, looking down at her and smiling. Josephine smiled back at him, but not a smile of welcome. Her excitement was quite gone, and she was not at all glad to see him. But if he had turned away, no doubt she would have called him back. She said, "How are you? You've come." "Yes," he answered, "I am very tired," and he came and sat down on a seat near her. She could see he was quite dazed, and smell that he still smelt of the city and of railway carriages. He looked very young, about 20, and both helpless and tired. The evening wind had dropped, the sun was spreading his fan in the northwest, and the chill of evening was descending over the garden. But up in the sky, among the gently moving masses of sulphurous clouds, it was still day. Cows lowed down in the marshes, cuckoos called monotonously in the glades of the dark blue woods, and close at hand a nightingale cried loud and clear. After a little while Sebastian said, "How long have you been down here?" "One day longer than you," she answered, and smiled in his face. "London is intolerable. I shall have to leave it," he went on. "I shall have to go soon too," she replied. There was no suggestion in either of their voices that they should leave it together, nor did they have a picture of each other in their mind's view of the future. For a minute each of them dreamed a customary dream of no war and freedom in the country, and then a sudden flood of kindness came into Josephine's heart, and she turned and smiled straight into Sebastian's face. At the same time she held up her right hand as if she were asking an alms, and Sebastian clutched it by the fingers, groaned with a laugh, and dragged her towards him. "Josephine," he said, and kissed her and let her go. Neither of them had the wits to do or say anything more. They were both dazed, and sat staring at nothing and thinking of last Tuesday. Their kiss was a kiss left over from Tuesday. They had neither of them caught up with the present. Tuesday evening hung like a cage in the air, and they were in it, a couple of green parrots, shut into it by love's hand in an idle moment. A bell rang out. "There, that's to dress for dinner," said Josephine, as if she did not intend to obey it. "Yes, I suppose we must go in," replied Sebastian, thinking of Everett. Everett was just the same to his mind as usual. She existed quite apart from Hampstead Heath and this orchard. He wanted to see her as much as ever, and had the same things as ever to say to her. It did not occur to him just now that kissing Josephine might alter their relationship. Josephine stood up and put out her hand. "Come on, old sleepy Ned," she said, as he rose and yawned and stretched. He thought he would kiss her again, but he did not, nor did he even take her hand, and with faces devoid of every sentiment of love, they stepped through the archway in the yew hedge, as if it were the gate out of dreamland into everyday, and walked up the rose garden at a distance of about 2 paces from one another. End of chapter 28, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.